A huge part of Russia's success, Russia's bounce back economically, it couldn't be done alone. So I said Russia's resource nationalist economy, its ability to reorient and restructure its economy to meet its own domestic needs, to ensure that companies are investing in Russia, to ensure that capital is being increased in Russia, despite whatever costs that may ultimately incur on to its private sector and its public sector, increase government spending to support those businesses who need to make these changes. Despite all of that, it wouldn't be able to defeat the sanctions regime if it were not for the momentum of de-dollarization, meaning that Russia right now is probably the leading country. It's not the only country, but it's a leading country in this de-dollarization trend. De-dollarization is a very serious development. It is one that I think spells doom for the collective West, for its dominance over the world. And all de-dollarization is, and it's not also, you do not need an economics degree for this, although studying economics will help you understand the intricacy. Studying political economy will help you understand the intricacies of this. But de-dollarization simply means that this uh, global reserve currency, the United States dollar, which was established because of U.S. imperial superpower status. The United States imposed this upon the world after World War II, and it has continued to an even more significant degree since 1971. But now, and this has been a development over time, but it has accelerated so much during the Ukraine crisis, the conflict, Russia's special military operation, because the dollar has been weaponized to such an extent that it threatens global economic stability itself, not just one country, not just trying to destroy one or so country, but by targeting Russia in this way, it has destabilized the entire global economy through the weaponization of the dollar. So now you have Russia pursuing de-dollarization faster and more um, and more effectively, maybe than any other country. And so I'm going to go over just a few developments, even just recently, that show how serious Russia is about de-dollarization and how much it is making progress in this regard. So here you have the Global Times reporting that Russia is removing the euro, only keeping yuan, RMB, Chinese currency, and gold in its national wealth fund. So the national wealth fund, all right, this is resulting in further de-dollarization, says the Global Times. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister said if the question is whether the euro will be reset, meaning not in the national wealth fund, then it will definitely be reset this year. It will consist of the fund is going to consist of up to 60% yuan and no more than 40% gold. And Russia may add rubles to the sovereign wealth fund. So the sovereign wealth fund is a huge institution. It's a financial institution. It's one of the biggest in Russia that is responsible for economic investment. And so the currency that this fund is going to hold is uh, not going to be euros anymore and not going to be dollars because dollars is not allowed anyway. It's going to be Chinese yuan, RMB, Chinese currency, and then its own currency in gold. So again, the de-dollarization process is accelerating. And so this is happening on a bilateral basis too. This is an important development here. Russia is consulting with Egypt now and also Iraq, by the way. But Egypt and Russia are working together. This was reported in Al Mayadeen that the Russian ambassador to Egypt, Georgy Beresenko, announces that consultations remain underway for the transitions of national currencies between Russia and Europe. That these consultations are underway as a means for Russia and Egypt to trade in their own currencies. According to the ambassador, from the spring of 2022, intensive consultations have been ongoing regarding the transition to national currencies in settlements and mutual trade. Despite all this pressure, Egypt remains faithful to the traditions of friendship between our countries laid down during the presidency of Gamal Abdel Nasser and continues to interact with Russia in the economic, cultural spheres in various international political platforms, said Borisenko, the Russian ambassador to Egypt. So there's going to be expanding cooperation. So this trade is important because Egypt is Russia's largest grain importer and also the biggest grain importer in the world. Some 11 to 13 million tons being purchased from abroad each year. And so imports from Russia have reached 191,000 tons of wheat since the start of this year. So again, these are huge numbers. These commodities are going to begin to be settled after major consultations in Russian rubles and in Egypt's national currency. So this is a very serious development. Um, you know, the sanctions have blown back in this way. And you also have Russia and Iraq discussing this as well. So this is from Russia Briefing. Here is what Russia Briefing had to say about Russia and Iraq moving closer to paying for oil. This was from February 6th. Russia and Iraq want to move payment for oil to reliable currencies. The latest energy-rich economies move to drop the US dollar. Russian foreign minister has been in Baghdad. So Russia was visiting Baghdad recently this month with its Iraqi counterpart Fawad Hussein discussing new payment mechanisms to replace the dollar, the US dollar. They have stated that Moscow and Baghdad plan to switch to paying for oil supplies in the currencies of reliable countries and move away from the dollar in bilateral economic relations. At the end of 2022, the United States introduced restrictions concerning cross-border payments in dollars from Iraq. According to local media, almost 80% of all transfers were blocked. The reason for this decision, the United States was the need for Iraq to comply with sanctions against a number of countries. So you hear that? The weaponization of the dollar. More weaponization of the dollar. Iraq was basically sanctioned by the United States, not able to make cross-border payments in dollars because it refused to go along with sanctions on Iran. Mind you, Iran and Iraq sit in the same region and have every right to trade with each other. But the United States said, no, you need to listen to us. You're supposed to be our puppet. So now you have the blocking of Iraqi transfers resulted in the dinar collapsing almost 10%, and that led to almost full-fledged economic crisis and protests in the country. So this has led to discussions about the dominance of the US dollar and calculations in the prospects of finding alternatives in the form of other currencies such as Chinese yuan or the Emirati dirham, which is the UAE's currency. So Russia, along with Iran, are now also under similar sanctions. So Moscow and Baghdad are also interested in developing trade relations regardless of the US dollar. And so the two parties, Sergei Lavrov and the Iraqi foreign minister, are discussing the possibility of trading for oil in friendly currencies because these are two energy-rich countries that could really benefit from that kind of trade. Oil for commodities, commodities for oil. In the current conditions, the United States currency restrictions upon our two countries, it's important to protect legitimate economic relations from pressures from the West by switching to payment supplies of oil in currencies from reliable countries. And so then they talk about that there is 4 Russian energy companies operational in Iraq: Lukoil, Gazprom Neft, Bashneft, and Rosneft. And then you have the largest West Karana 2 field together with the Iraqi company North Oil Company. So they're working on an oil field together. So essentially, these two countries are close, Russia and Iraq, and they want to move away from the weaponization of the dollar. And the Chinese currency is key here because China's economic position gives it a lot of leverage. And so a lot of these countries like Russia, Iraq, a lot of these countries see China's RMB as a stable currency, one that has reliability that can be used in a basket of currencies that are pegged to commodities. And that is how de-dollarization, at least in the initial period, is going to look. And so that's what's happening. And this is a very serious development because you actually do have the Western financial corporate media, the Western collective West media, actually talking about this very seriously. They are sounding the alarm. Okay. And you can see this in the pages of the Financial Times, and I'm going to bring up a few pieces here. And there's a debate happening actually in the Financial Times and in other economic-centered establishment media outlets, collective West outlets, sounding the alarm about this development. One such person is someone named Sultan Pozar. And this person is important. They are an economist at Credit Suisse, a dominant collective West financial institution that arguably has its hands in a lot of the ways in which the US dollar preys upon the global South. It's a very key institution. It is a key creditor. And Credit Suisse and Zoltan Pozar have something very interesting to say about why this is important. And so I'm going to pull that up now. But Zoltan Pozar also worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He is a huge insider. He's an economist. And he is talking about how this is very serious. Well, actually, no, that's not the right article. I'm going to pull that up because that's a part of the debate. So there's a debate happening. And Zoltan Pozar sounds the alarm. He says great power conflict puts the dollar's exorbitant privilege under threat. The monetary order is already being challenged by de-dollarization efforts in central bank digital currencies. So he was a part of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He is now part of Credit Suisse as an economist. He's the head of short-term interest rate strategy. And so the weaponization of the dollar, there's so many parts of this. There's the sanctions. There's also the interest rate hikes to try to bring down inflation caused by sanctions, which then hurt investment globally, which then hurts countries all over the world trying to raise their level of development with high interest rates. They have a hard time getting credit, just like a lot of people are having a hard time getting credit. So this has caused the world to look, especially Russia, China, and this new multipolar world order. These countries leading it, Iran, China, Russia, they're looking at this and saying, we need to do this ourselves. We need to build a different monetary infrastructure. So, since the end of the Cold War, said Pozar, the world has largely enjoyed a unipolar era. The US was the undisputed hegemon, globalization was the economic order, and the dollar was the currency of choice. But today, geopolitics once again poses a formidable set of challenges to the existing world order. That means investors have to discount new risks. China is proactively rewriting a fresh set of rules as it replays the great game, creating a new type of globalization through institutions such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Plus group of emerging economies, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a collective security alliance of 8 countries. While under lockdown, Beijing forged a special relationship with Moscow and Tehran. This relationship with Russia, with the unwitting assistance of global warming, is helping extend China's BRI through Arctic shipping lanes. In late last year, we saw the very first summit between China and the GCC, and hence a deepening of China's ties with OPEC+. All of this may lead to one world, two systems arrangement. If we are drifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar one, and if the G20 fractures into the camps of the G7 plus Australia, BRICS plus, and the non-aligned, it's impossible that these rifts will not affect the international monetary system. Growing macroeconomic imbalances in the US further adds to these risks. I mean, he's not lying here, although Zoltan and I do not share the same perspectives on whether this is a good development or not. Got to say that he's laying it quite right. You know, he's laying it out here quite correctly. The dollar-based monetary order is already being challenged in multiple ways, but 2 in particular stand out: the spread of de-dollarization efforts in central bank digital currencies. De-dollarization is not a new theme. It started with the launch of quantitative easing in the wake of the financial crisis, as current account surplus countries frown at the idea of negative real return on their savings, a fancy term for we don't want to be plundered anymore, and you're going to plunder us because you crashed the world economy, and you're going to take everything away from us. You're going to take everything back to stabilize and prop up your fiat economy. That's essentially what that means. But recently, the pace of de-dollarization appears to have picked up. China and India, and over the past year, China and India have been paying for Russian commodities in renminbi, rupees, and UAE dirhams. India has launched a rupee settlement mechanism for its international transaction, while China asked GCC countries to make full use of Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange for RMB settlement of oil and gas trades over the next 3 to 5 years. With the expansion of BRICS to beyond Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the de-dollarization to trade flows may proliferate. Indeed. I mean, That's what's been happening. Russia and China, Russia and India, China and India. These countries, Iran, all of these countries are looking for new ways to settle their trade in different currencies. And all of them, not India, but China, Russia, Iran, all these countries have sanctions to worry about. China, of course, has this major economy, which, if it relies solely on US dollars, it will become more and more vulnerable to what Russia has gone through. It has been very smart in not falling into that trap. And I think that it was very aware of it from the very beginning. And India, too, knowing that economic growth it really does ensure political stability in India, which is not the most politically stable country, let's be honest. India has had a lot of protests, a lot of mass unrest. There is serious problems internally in India. But if India is going to legitimately grow, it cannot be under the thumb of the US and collective West led economy. It has done that before during colonialism, and millions of people in India ended up dying, and the country was abject poor and still suffers from abject poverty in many areas, especially when it comes to the majority peasant population, the majority rural worker population. But mind you, that extreme poverty in India will go down if it pursues an independent policy, especially in terms of currency. Of course, politics will have a lot to do with it, but this is also a big part of it. So India knows that its political legitimacy hinges on de-dollarization as well. So central bank digital currencies could also accelerate their transition. China has changed the strategy through its internationalizing the RMB. Given that financial sanctions are implemented through the balance sheets of Western banks and that these institutions form the backbone of correspondent banking system that underpins the dollar, using the same network to internationalize the RMB may have come with risks. To get around this, a new network was needed. Around the world, but particularly in the global East and South, the central bank digital currencies are spreading like fast growing kudzu vines, and more than half of the world's central banks exploring or developing digital currencies with pilots or research, according to the IMF. They will be increasingly interlinked. Central banks interlinked through these central bank digital currencies essentially recreate a network of correspondent banks that the US dollar system runs on. Instead of correspondent banks, think more of correspondent central banks. The emerging central bank digital currency based network, enforced with bilateral currency swap lines, could enable central banks in the global East and South to serve as foreign exchange dealers to intermediate currency flows between local banking systems, all without referencing the dollar or touching the Western banking system. I mean, create a digital currency, create a digital currency infrastructure, create the ability to do this independent of the dollar. That's what these countries are doing. Change is already afoot. The current account surpluses of China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia are at a record. These surpluses are largely not being recycled into traditional reserve assets like treasuries, which offer negative real returns at current inflation rates. Instead, we have seen more demand for gold, commodities, and geopolitical investments, such as funding the BRI and helping allies and neighbors in need, like Turkey, Egypt, or Pakistan. Leftover surpluses are held increasingly in bank deposits in liquid form to retain much needed options for a changing world. In finance, everything is about marginal flows. These matter the most for the largest marginal borrower, the US Treasury. If less trade is invoiced in US dollars and there's dwindling recycling of US dollar surpluses into traditional reserve assets such as treasuries, the exorbitant privilege that the dollar holds as the international reserve currency could be under assault. So that's Sultan Pozar, former Federal Reserve Bank of New York, also of Credit Suisse currently, head of interest rate strategy. So he is someone who knows a lot about the Western financial system, and he's sounding the alarm about this. Um, and he is not the only one at Financial Times. Before I get to that, what it's saying here, it's not that complicated actually. By creating these alternative mechanisms and reorienting where the currencies are going, where the investment is going. So instead of this money being stored in treasuries, in these reserve banks, right? These treasuries that are then used to then mediate or intermediate with Western banking and US banking systems, because the dollar is the dominant currency and you need to do everything around the rules that the US dollar plays by, meaning US rules, really. If you create a central banking digital currency, if you create this infrastructure to trade and do currency swaps and these kind of things independently of the US dollar, then yes, you can accelerate projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, these infrastructure projects. You can, dare I say, help neighbors in need through mutual trade and investment, which is win-win. That's what China always talks about, win-win cooperation. You can go to Pakistan with the uh, um, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, which has thousands of projects, right? Some of them hundreds completed, more underway. You go to Pakistan, you go to Turkey, launch a high-speed rail line. You can do that sort of stuff. And you can do that on a massive basis, much bigger basis than now if you can create this independent currency infrastructure. And that's what's happening. So they're sounding the alarm. They're sounding the alarm. And it's not just Zoltan Pozar. It's also Mr. Nouriel Rubini. The greenback is bound sooner or later to feel the effects of intensifying geopolitical rivalry. A bipolar currency regime will replace the dollar's exorbitant privilege. So this person is the chief economist at Atlas Atlantic Team and professor emeritus at the Stern School of Business. And it talks about how China's RMB, how China is actually becoming, because of this geopolitical rivalry, becoming a reference point in the world economy, to the point where you have now countries looking at this conflict between China and the United States as an opportunity to choose a side. So I don't need to read the article because he goes over a lot of the same points as Zoltan Pozar. But what he says, though, is that from a different reference point, he's looking at the US-China conflict, this new Cold War that the US is fueling. The world is looking at this and saying, okay, we got to choose a side now because the United States is attacking China, and we're likely to understand this as a possible attack on us if we get too close to China. So some countries will just choose the United States, but the vast majority are choosing China because China has a stable economy. China has economic output in real infrastructure benefit. There's real benefits to trading with China. So if you trade with the United States, you'll get little return and a lot of conditionalities. You'll have to suffer through austerity, likely. You will have to suffer through a lot of interference politically. In China, it's different. So you have even Saudi Arabia saying, no, 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 I've got to look at China as a possible trading partner that is much closer to us than before, because that's how we are going to maintain our stability economically. That's how we are going to move forward economically. So the point here is that this emerging de-dollarization, this rapid de-dollarization, is a byproduct, a blowback from the weaponization of the dollar, from the United States, from the imperial order that it is dictating, this unipolar imperial order that it is dictating. The collective West, of course, being the umbrella from which this order is enforced. And the US dollar has become a wrecking ball. For Europe, we see the Russian oil price cap backfiring and accelerating the same process, trying to cut Russia off from being able to trade its oil at prices that are reasonable for its economy. Now it's going to look away from Europe, or even away from third-party options to Europe, and start looking to the global south. So the blowback, right? The expansion of BRICS, the expansion of multilateral institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of Russia's multilateral ties with India, with Iran, with China, all of this put together is part of coming up with the foundation and the infrastructure necessary for true de-dollarization. It's going to take some time. We're not necessarily there yet, but by the numbers, we are seeing this happen. The IMF, major financial institutions are saying that a lot of countries are independently dropping US dollars from their current foreign currency reserves in place of RMB, in place of rubles. But the RMB is the Chinese currency is going to be the primary point of reference, right? It's going to be the primary point of reference for this de-dollarization trend. Russia's coming up with its own independent monetary system. Russia and in Iran have just linked their banks. So on and on and on. This is going to continue to accelerate this process. And it's one way that Russia has been able to defeat the sanctions regime. And arguably, it is the way for the global south, for China, for the rest of the world to do the same. And that's why they're coordinating more and more. That's why, while this movement may not be ideological in so many respects, because India, Russia, China, all different countries, Iran, all different political systems, ideologically, politically, but they are similar in economic interests at a very base level. And they all can see that they have more to gain from each other than they do from being apart, right? They have more to gain from collectively working together. So de-dollarization is here to stay. And it's going to accelerate the more that the United States and the more that the EU and the collective West continue this policy of provoking, of militarizing, of waging war and aggression and conflict toward these major powers, Russia and China, which are the future of the global economy. If Russia can grow positively amid these sanctions, what would Russia do without the sanctions? It would be doing what it was doing before the sanctions, which is growing at a pretty steady clip and taking care of a lot of domestic issues. And then, of course, becoming more assertive on the world stage, helping with integration in Eurasia. China, of course, we don't even need to review all of the ways in which China is so important, not just in providing a stable currency with a prosperous economic base behind it, one that is state directed, and one that has at its core principles like non-interference and infrastructure development behind it, prosperity, common prosperity behind it. But also you have China's just overall economic miracle, its ability to alleviate poverty, and its ability to be able to ride through the economic storm of the neoliberal dominated world economy, because it has been able to do that. Look at what happened in 2007, 2008. China did not collapse. China did not collapse. China in 2020, it did not collapse. It grew in 2020. There was not negative growth like many of the world's economies in 2020 for China during the whole COVID situation. No, China had the capacity to continue to grow and achieve pretty immense feats. So with that said, you have India now with a rapidly industrializing and growing economy. You have these major global south countries ready to lead the way, and that's what de-dollarization is. It's part of that larger process.